Hey guys, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we'll be doing Nicias and Crassus from those two respective states. So without further ado, let's begin with Nicias. So Nicias was extremely wealthy. His family owned a bunch of silver mines around the city, and it is said that he owned up over 1,000 slaves. So very powerful man and very fitting to ultimately be head of the oligarchic government in Athens. Plutarch references a quote from Aristotle saying, "Three eminent above all others for love of their citizens were Nicias, Thucydides, and Thermomenes." However, the lattermost was less so than the former two. Aristotle says. So in effect, he says Nicias and Thucydides were the most loving of their citizens. Despite this, they were actually both heads of the oligarchic government. Athens was always sort of split between the oligarchs and the democrats, sort of like we have in Western culture, often in any sort of two-party system. But either way, Thucydides came a bit before Nicias as head of the oligarchic government. Following him came Pericles, who we discussed earlier, and following Pericles' death, Nicias takes the head of the oligarchic government with the opponent of Cleon, who was the head of the democratic government. Cleon sort of falls out of favor with respect to the Athenian populace because he was seen as quite greedy, and they felt like they couldn't trust him. Despite him being quite charitable, they really saw his intentions as ill and too politically motivated, whereas Nicias was just so rich and he had so much to lose, they felt very much they could trust him more than Nicias. He was extremely fearful of his citizens. Plutarch says, "For men fear those who scorn them, but exalt men who fear them." So there's kind of a common mantra saying that you can lead by being feared or being loved. But I guess a third one in this case would be you can lead through fear, because through the fear they found a way to trust him. He was so scared of the people he rarely left his house. He often had this assistant called Hero, Hiero, who sort of represented him often in public affairs and or not at the assembly, but often in terms of negotiations and speaking with other people, and he spoke very well of him. He trained this hero very well and cared for him like a son, so very important for Nicias. Nicias seems as though he was quite shy. While a general, he spent most of his time in the war room and didn't really socialize with the soldiers too much, despite the fact that he did fight alongside them on the battlefield. He was a hard worker. He was always the first one in the assembly and the last one out. So he came into power during the Peloponnesian War. It had been dragging on for quite a while, and the Spartans and the Athenians were growing quite tired and quite frustrated with how the war was turning out. So an individual named Laches proposes the Truce of Laches, which Nicias supports, and ultimately it goes through, but Cleon, Nicias' opponent, and Brasides from Sparta really opposed it. So Brasides sort of causes a sort of conflict with respect to the Athens, and Cleon uses it as an opportunity to attack the Spartans and ultimately breaks the Truce of Laches. Fortunately for Nicias and the peace between the two nations, both Brasides and Cleon died in this outbreak, so the opportunity for peace vastly improved, and Nicias ultimately drafts what's called the Peace of Nicias, which lasts a decent amount of time and temporarily postponed the Peloponnesian War. However, unfortunately, to fill Cleon's gap, a new upstart on the democratic side, a populist named Alcibiades, comes into play, who really wanted to break the truce of Nicias, as it's said that he was really just jealous that he was not consulted when creating the truce. So he starts going to Athens' allies to sort of prompt them to get ready for a war. And at one point when the Spartans send an envoy of representatives to discuss the particulars of the truce, of the peace of Nicias, Alcibiades secretly meets with them before and tells them that the Athenians couldn't be trusted. So with that, the Spartans allow Alcibiades to represent them in assembly, giving up their civic duty. And while at the assembly, he tells the Athenians that the Spartans couldn't be trusted and were going to break their vows. So with that, both sides were not trusting of each other and not trusting of Nicias, and the truce breaks down. And Nicias sort of falls out of favor with the people. With that, Sicily then comes to the Athenians asking for assistance. The people of Segesta had a war against the Hellenes, and they asked Athens to help. Nicias, once again, being a lover of peace and lover of non-violence, it said in all of his wars he led with fear, which ultimately led to many great successes on his part, and he avoided long wars, and that's obviously what he tried doing with the Spartan war. So he really very much opposed this one, but Alcibiades was very for the war. Nicias criticized him, saying he just wanted personal gain and just wanted to turn Athens into an empire and achieve glory. And that is actually exactly what Alcibiades wanted. And it seems as though that's also what the Athenian people wanted, because they kind of shoved Nicias aside and agree with Alcibiades to go forward with the war. So Nicias sort of bluffs by proposing that they send 51,000 men and 1,300 archers and 150 galleys. But the people call him on his bluff, and they actually get more enthusiastic about this, and they end up going with such a large army. So Alcibiades, Nicias, and one other individual were given autonomous control of the army in Sicily. With that, Alcibiades finally starts falling out of favor in Athens, as he gets accused of defiling some Hermes statues. And interestingly enough, this he probably didn't actually do, but it was probably just the built-up loss of fame he got from all the sort of cheating and trickery he had pulled. So with that, they call him to court, but ultimately he doesn't end up showing up, and he defects to Sparta, who accept him with open arms and hope that he will be the one to help them defeat the Athenians. So Nicias, they replace Alcibiades and there are 3 generals, but the Spartans start approaching their army in Sicily. So they had to sort of leave part of their army in defense against the Spartans while they tried sieging the town of Syracuse, the capital of Sicily at the time. Unfortunately, he gets called back from the Athenians to help defend them against Sparta, but he sort of knew that the Athenians would be upset with his failures in Sicily and failures to come against Sparta, and he thought that he would be killed. So he says that he would rather be killed by the enemy than by his own people. And that's why Plutarch puts in this quote, "I would rather be put to death by you than with you," which was actually by Leon of Byzantium. But Plutarch thought it would be fitting in respect to Nicias here. So ultimately, he gets captured by the enemy, who's named Gylippus, and he tells Gylippus about all the times that he had spared him, and Gylippus didn't really want to kill him, but Nicias got killed, and that was the end of him. So yeah, we'll get back to more about this. I guess one thing I forgot to note was he was addicted to divination, and I think he would make sacrifices every day, and he donated a lot of money to religious festivals. At one point, an individual came to a play dressed up as Dionysius, and he admired so much the guy's look that he freed him from slavery. Partly, I think, his addiction to divination was just the result of his fear. He was worried about people would steal from him. He was worried that the gods would steal from him, but his fearfulness was probably his greatest virtue rather than his greatest vice. But yeah, he was also, despite being super wealthy, he was very charitable and really gave more than he got. So yeah, without further ado, let's continue on to Crassus. We'll get more to him on the comparison if you're interested in that. So Crassus is titled the richest man in Rome, and that is what he was. Ultimately, at his peak, he got up to 7,100 talents, which is the equivalent of 226 tons of gold, or 9 billion US dollars. But that is even more with respect to the size of the nation. Like 9 billion in a nation of 300 million, like in the United States, is obviously a not, but it's not number one. But considering the size of Rome, he was extremely wealthy. At one point, he ends up giving enough food for every citizen, enough corn for every citizen of Rome for 3 months, just as a charitable donation. So yeah, extremely wealthy. But Plutarch notes that he gained his wealth through what he calls fire and ill practice. He was very unethical in achieving his money, and we'll get into that. But either way, he didn't actually grow up as wealthy. His father was actually consul and censor, which are the two highest achievements in Rome, but they all lived in one house. He had 2 other brothers, and they all shared a table, and that's where Plutarch says that it shaped his temperance and moderation of diet. So I guess he was, despite all the wealth he ultimately got, and later he throws a bunch of parties with a bunch of plebeians, but he was always moderate in terms of his diet. But yeah, his brother ends up dying. His elder brother dies, and he marries his brother's widow, which, I don't know, take what you want. Plutarch considered it pretty important, and he ultimately seems to have married her 3 times. I don't know what was the cause of that, but I guess maybe he just struggled in his marital life. At one point, it said he fell in love with this Vestal virgin, and which was illegal at the time, and the people of Rome really tried slandering him for this. But ultimately, it's found out that he just really wanted her estate, because after he claimed he got hold of her estate, he sort of pushed her aside and didn't really care about her. So I guess what these 2 anecdotes, that of his wife and that of this Vestal virgin, was that he just really didn't have a lot of love in his life. He just married his brother's widow, perhaps to keep the family together, and he really didn't love this Vestal virgin. He just wanted the estate. So I think that's really what can be derived from this. But either way, he gets a lot of his wealth through, he hires 500 slaves who are builders and architects, and they go around the town looking for burning buildings in which he would buy at a discount. It's not explicitly said, but I think it's implied that he was actually burning these buildings so that he could buy them at a discount. Kind of like the conflict of interest that the privatization of firefighters led to, particularly in New York in the time of Tammany. And since there were privatized firefighters, they were completely incentivized to burn the houses. So with this, he was probably incentivized to burn buildings to buy them at a discount. So obviously a very corrupt way of achieving a great amount of wealth. But ultimately, he does end up giving it into a lot of charity, and he does do some good things with it, but definitely not a good guy. And you'll see he's even more cruel. We'll get to that. But he was respectful of people of all classes. That's why at the time there was the optimes and the populares, who were the 2 political factions in Rome at the time, basically kind of like the oligarchs and the populists. But he was sort of the middle ground. He's ultimately what bridges the gap between Pompey and Julius Caesar, called the First Triumvirate. And it was probably him that kept them from breaking out into a war earlier. But either way, he respected people because he was kind of the middle ground between these people. He respected people of all classes. It said that he referred to everyone by name. So even slaves, he would not call you, hey, slave. He would call them by their name, which was considered a very respectful thing to do. He would invite, it said at his dinners, although actually they were probably lavish in terms of the building and lavish in terms of all the Oh, no, it's considered that his meals were not very lavish at all, and he ate them predominantly with plebeians. Even kind of an interesting business anecdote is that he never built buildings. The only building he ever built was his house. He obviously believed in real estate speculation and buying land, but he sort of thought actually building buildings was a fool's action. So hard to say what can be derived from that, but he said that, and Plutarch says this is wrong, no man was rich who could not support a war out of his own substance. So Plutarch completely disagrees with this, but I think it's kind of important. There's Archidemus says war has no rations. So basically, anyone can create war, anyone can have power at war, but he seemed to believe that in order to be successful in terms of military endeavors, you had to be wealthy. And at least that was a particular qualification for him, but that might not have been a qualification for everyone. But either way, kind of going, when he's pretty young, actually, his Cinna and Marius take over Rome, and they start killing all supporters of Sylla. Cinna and Marius started killing all their supporters. That was the second time Rome got invaded. Sylla invaded it for the first time, and Crassus's father was one of the supporters who was killed, and his brother was also killed. So with this, he runs away from the city, fearing that he would be killed too, which was obviously not a poor decision, because he probably would have got killed if he stayed. But he takes with him 10 slaves and 3 friends, and he doesn't even hide in a town, he hides in a cave. And fortunately, he sends a letter to this individual named Vabius, and Vabius is very partial and very much supports and likes Crassus, so he buys the land next to the cave and sends him meals there, so supports him. All these individuals have some sort of mentor or some sort of assistance from someone powerful. So at this time, he was not too wealthy. He had about 300 talents, which is obviously very wealthy, but he still wasn't that wealthy. But they send him meals in this cave. Vabius even sends him 2 women, and at first Crassus is like, oh no, like they found out I'm here, but then they say, oh, we're here for our new master. So Vabius sent Crassus 2 females to play with, which is I don't know, just an interesting anecdote that Plutarch chose to put in. So ultimately, Cinna dies, and he goes on a brief stint as a general for Metellus. He doesn't really achieve too much fighting for Metellus, but then he starts fighting for Sylla, who he very much greatly admired, and pretty much all the people, except for those few supporters of Marius at the time, were quite fond of Sylla. He really wanted to march on Rome, but he gets sent to fight a different battle, and he asks Sylla to send him an envoy, and Sylla really is ashamed of this, and Sylla points out that Crassus is supposed to be the envoy, but Sylla is very quick in terms of gauging people, and he sees that Crassus is pretty greedy and pretty not as honorable as the other individuals who are following him. Pompey, who is another person who really liked Sylla and wanted to be his student as well, got a great deal of fame back in Rome, and this really made Crassus jealous. At one point, he sees Sylla take off his helmet and salute Pompey, and this makes Crassus extremely jealous and really upsets him. Actually, an interesting point, and try not to go on too big of a tangent, this Roman salute, which is famous, Nazi Germany sort of adopted it later. It's the straight 135-degree angle, straight arm. There's actually no depictions or descriptions of it from ancient Rome, so it only really started getting drawn as a perfectly straight arm in the 1800s in France. So interesting how history has changed, because it could have been a super crooked arm that they could have been putting up. It could have been a completely different type of salute from how we depict it today. But either way, this salute from Sylla made Crassus quite jealous. So he further proved, ultimately Sylla manages to take Rome for the second time, and this time as a dictator he is much more harsh and starts killing many individuals. Crassus sees this as an opportunity to gain a lot of land and gain a lot of assets, and this is probably where he gets the vast majority of his wealth through Sylla's terror that he caused. At one point, Sylla sees, while Crassus was representing public office, sees what Crassus is doing and vows to make him never an officer under him in terms of public affairs. So even Pompey didn't really win the full affection of Sylla. It's Lucullus, who is actually discussed in the most previous video. Lucullus was Sylla's favorite. But either way, Crassus was not overly bitter. Plutarch says he was just vexed by how Pompey was able to get so much affection. Soon after, an even younger individual, Pompey was younger than Crassus and came from a less favorable family. So this also sort of vexed and upset Crassus. But even more so, this new individual, this new upstart, comes out named Julius Caesar, who is, you probably know of and we'll cover very soon. I'm very much looking forward to that. And he is even greater than Pompey in terms of military achievement. And this also vexes Crassus because despite Crassus's ability to become the richest guy in all of Rome, he just cannot seem to compete with these two guys in terms of winning favor outside of Rome. But inside of Rome, he is actually more successful than Pompey in terms of achieving political gain. Pompey was more successful, it's considered, outside of Rome, whereas he was considered more successful inside of Rome because he was a great orator and he studied oration very well. And said that he studied oration so much that he was better than most naturals. But he was also a student of Aristotle, and he had this student called Alexander. But it's not Alexander the Great, a different Alexander. But this Alexander would follow Crassus around wherever he went. But Crassus, it seems, never paid him. So Plutarch derives that this meant that Crassus was actually a pretty pleasant guy to be around for a teacher to be willing to spend time with him free of charge. It said that once they went on a journey together, he would come with him on all the journeys. He would lend him a coat, but then when he returned from the journey, he would ask it back. So it's just kind of indicative of what their friendship was. It was one of mutual. It wasn't a form of payment or employment, but actually a friendship. It said that he lent money to all his friends with no interest, which is interesting, but no pun intended. But he would demand repayment of the principal at immediate urgency. So it said that the burden of him recalling the debt was greater than the lack of interest that he put on it. So it was sort of difficult in that regard. So there three main political people at the time were Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Cato was sort of older at this time, and he was more just a symbol at this point. So he did not really actually have too much political sway at this point. It said that Pompey was thoughtful and conservative, and he represented the optimes, and Caesar was violent and volatile, whereas Crassus sort of gained support from somewhat in the middle ground, and they formed the first triumvirate. Ultimately, when Crassus eventually passes away, it's just Pompey versus Caesar, who ultimately ruptures and causes the state to fall into an empire when Caesar crosses the Rubicon. But either way, one individual says that Crassus had corn in his head, which is the Romans used to put corn around a bull's horn to prove if it had been like a violent bull. So it was like what the individual was trying to say was that Crassus everyone knew that they couldn't trust him. So for that reason, they could trust him because they knew what his intentions were, and it was obvious. So It's an interesting little anecdote, I think. So ultimately, there's this war breaks out called the Third Civil Revolt, or the War of Spartacus. I don't know if you've seen the movie called Spartacus. It's pretty good. It's there was this gladiator school by Alcibiades that was full of Thracians and Gauls, and this one particular Spartan named Spartacus was of Thracian descent, and they cause an uprising and break out. 78 of them break out, and they sort of go school to school and start an uprising of gladiators. So it's kind of a revolt of these poor slaves. And Nicias, as the other generals were away off having conquering lands and stuff, Crassus was tasked with fighting off this revolt. So he hires a bunch of slaves, which is probably not a good idea, hiring slaves to kill slaves, and the morale is extremely, extremely weak. But what he does to motivate them is it's called a decimation, where he kills 1/10 of the army, and this really strikes a lot of fear into them, and quickly they change from unmotivated to very motivated. And what it said he demonstrated was that he was more dangerous than the enemy. Ultimately, the Spartacus and his men retreat into Italy, and they try building this big ditch, and it was an extremely ambitious plan, but Spartacus builds a bridge and gets over it. But he calls for Lucullus and Pompey to come and help them, but then he's worried that they will steal his fame. And Spartacus is worried that he'll quickly be defeated, so they decide to hit the battlefield right away. And Spartacus tries killing Crassus right away. He tries approaching him, but Spartacus dies, and here's a little image of Spartacus being killed. And 6,000 of these gladiators and slaves are captured. What he does is he crucifies all 6,000 of them along the road to Rome. And here's an image. This is obviously pre-Jesus Christ, so it was in no ways an honor, and it wasn't even an honor for Jesus Christ, but either way, it was a pretty brutal thing to do. I can only imagine the pain, and he let them rot there, so everyone could see what happens to people who revolt. So I think, no matter how much charity or whatnot this guy did, that was, I think, one of the harshest things ever done in history. 6,000 people. Could you imagine walking the road to Rome and seeing 6,000 crucified bodies? I think that would be quite the sight. The road is called Via Appia. Very, very cool road. The main road from the south that led into Rome. So either way, Pompey, he wanted to become consul, and Pompey became consul, and Pompey decides that he would actually help Crassus, because he knew that if he helped Crassus out, he would be indebted to him, and who better to have indebted to you than the richest guy in Rome? So even though they get consulship together, they both kind of clash, and really nothing gets done. There's kind of a stagnation, and in the meantime, he helps Caesar become Pontifex Maximus, which is the high priest. He also, early in Caesar's career, when he was praetor, helped finance some of his journeys that would have otherwise failed. So if it weren't for Crassus, Julius Caesar never would have become Julius Caesar. And in many ways, Crassus was a great mentor to Julius Caesar, although he might not have known it, because Crassus was secretly a bit jealous of him. At one point, Julius Caesar got captured by a bunch of pirates, and he says, "O Crassus, how great a pleasure wilt thou taste when thou hearest of my capture." Just knowing that kind of a joke as to Crassus's jealousy of both Pompey and Caesar. But either way, they still kind of got along, and same thing with Pompey and Crassus. They still got along, but eventually they both get. Pompey, as consul, gets sent off to fight in Hispanias after Pompey actually became censor, which is probably the highest role you can, but consul was the leader of the army, so he gets sent off to the Hispanias, and Crassus gets sent off to Syria. So both get sent off to expand the Roman Republic. With this, it was a great opportunity for Crassus to just get greater wealth, but he was still kind of like, he'd kind of already won the war of wealth, so he really wanted to achieve military success, and as had Julius and Pompey. So the Armenians offered to help Crassus and send them troops if they went through Armenia on the route to Syria. This would help keep the Armenian soldiers seasoned, and it would help protect them. But he denies this. He wants to go straight into Syria and get glory faster. He crosses the Euphrates, which is one of the major rivers down there, and he tries to conquer the Pathier. And eventually in the Battle of Carthage, he is defeated by numerically fewer men. So it's quite a poor victory on Crassus. They were not ready to fight the horse archers that they had, and ultimately they start losing. They contemplate retreating and contemplate regrouping, but Crassus believes that they'd run out of arrows, which is kind of foolish thing to assume, and they start trying to have negotiations, but secretly Crassus just wanted a war anyways. But this one junior general named Octavius, not the more famous Octavius, but thinks that they were about to attack, so he startles a horse and the war breaks out, and Crassus ultimately dies. And that is the end of the richest man in Rome. So kind of a quote that's kind of, it's been very, I've thought about it for a long time, and I thought it was very important, by Machiavelli in his Discourses, chapter 10. And this, I think, has important implication here. Quote goes, "Of all men who have been eulogized, those that deserve it most have been authors and founders of religions." I think that's fair. He says, "Next come such as have established republics or kingdoms." So that's also fair, I think, as well. "After these, the most celebrated are those who have commanded armies and have extended possessions of their kingdoms or countries." So this is kind of where these individuals fell in terms of who to honor the most. The Pompey probably gets to this level, the one who expands the state of Rome. However, Julius Caesar, in my opinion, is a greater individual because he actually creates a state. The only next thing would be to have created a religion, which would have been probably the highest honor that Machiavelli could have admired. But to continue with the quote, he says, "To these may be added literary men, but these are different according to kinds. As they are different kinds, they are celebrated according to their respective degrees of excellence." So this, I think, would fall those such as Shakespeare, or at the time he didn't include it, but I think those such as Beethoven would be included in this category, and great artists or great sharers of stories that have gone down in history. And then he continues, "All others, and their number is infinite, receive such share of praise as pertains to the exercise of their arts or professions." So that's kind of just the general man. And how this ties into Crassus is that he didn't want to just be a wealthy guy. He wanted to achieve greater glory. And the next step for him would be to expand the empire and win battles, as had Pompey and Caesar. That's kind of, and this is, interestingly enough, this quote almost coincides completely with history. The most famous people ever are those founders and writers of religions. Next are those conquerors, and next are generals or warriors, and next are those in pop culture and those who create great works of arts. And then the next is just the common citizen, and that's why it's kind of a sad quote, and it's kind of, I've thought of it for quite a while, but they are infinite in number. If you don't really jump into one of these next categories, you will probably die without ever being having your name passed down in history. So yeah, that's by Machiavelli. Probably not the best person to be reading from, but Machiavelli says it as it is. He's pretty blunt, and that's pretty much how the world works. Interesting enough, I like how he uses the term infinite in number, because probably one of the most important symbols is the pyramid. There are more people at the bottom of the rung and fewer people at the top. So, and he goes so far as to say the bottom of the pyramid is infinite, whereas the top of the pyramid there are very, very few. So, yeah, I guess we'll move on to the comparison. So he says Nicias' estate was more honestly attained, and I think that is fair. Although he did have a lot of slaves, he did not do it through buying burnt assets and through the Sylla's bloodbath, buying the estates of dead people. So that's kind of a point on Nicias' part. But also, I think in Crassus' defense, he was more self-made. So I think that should be taken into account, as Nicias didn't grow his state too much in his own lifetime, whereas Crassus grew it drastically. Plutarch compares the two gifts they gave them. Nicias gave more public gifts, such as theaters and plays and gifts to the gods, whereas Crassus were mostly feasts. But he kind of completely redeems himself on the one occasion right before he goes on the battle in Syria. He gives enough corn to feed every citizen of Rome for 3 months, and he also donates 1/10 of his wealth to Hercules. So he kind of redeems himself, but I don't think any amount of charity he could do could redeem the 6,000 people he crucified and the killing of 1/10 of his army. So I think that is pretty cruel. He says, and also Plutarch notes that there's inconsistency as a vice in itself. So he was pretty much a horrible guy his whole life, and then he suddenly does this extravagant charity endeavor, and he says that inconsistency is a vice in itself. So I think that's fair. So Nicias was abused by Alcibiades, while Crassus was more of the abuser. It said he would constantly, that he was the middle ground between Pompey and Caesar, but he would also make friends and make allies just back and forth, sort of pretty sporadically. That's why it was kind of hard to imagine what he was doing. So it was considered that he was an abuser in terms of political life. He gave a lot of people loans rather than just handing money out, whereas Nicias was kind of abused, and he was always very fearful. He was almost too much so. He was almost too timid. One of the main points of comparison is that Nicias really pushed for peace, whereas Crassus really pushed for expansion. And Nicias, his intents of peace were to better the country, and even when he was forced into warfare, he still cared about the country. Whereas Crassus, I believe his intentions were completely personal. Down in Syria, he really pushed for this battle when it wasn't the best idea. But Plutarch defends his actions in saying that if he had been successful in Syria, we might have had a very different perspective of him. Sort of the history is written by the victor sort of quote. He has an actual quote here. Those who praise Alexander's enterprise and blame that of Crassus judge of the beginning unfairly by the results. So just judging by the results is unfair. in the sense that they both made rash decisions. So, in terms of comparisons, there are many. They are both extremely wealthy, the two wealthiest people in all of the Plutarch's lives and all that we will be covering, and they both were quite good generals, and they both gave quite a bit to charity. I guess the very last comparison was that Plutarch gives to Crassus is that Crassus died more gloriously in that he was killed in battle, whereas Nicias was killed after being captured and didn't die on the battlefield. So one last little +1 for Crassus, but in all, I think Nicias was undoubtedly the better man of the two, for many of the things Crassus had done are definitely unforgivable, while Nicias, despite being a slave owner, he was very much an advocate for peace and very much a good guy. So yeah, two quite different but good individuals to be compared. So I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope you watch the next one, or if you haven't seen the previous ones, you watch those too. Thanks so much. Bye.